It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a privilege to be here. Anytime you get a chance to share the Word of God, anytime you get to teach, instruct, help people to grow and learn, it's a privilege. And it's been a blessing to walk alongside with Reggie and Julie and the family for a long time. And if you haven't ever been involved in ministry, been involved in a church, you don't really understand what it really takes. And it takes special leading, special calling, and just downright special guts to be able to do it. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for people who want to quit easily, even though a lot of times you'll want to quit. But Reggie has been a blessing to watch him grow and learn and be faithful. And so this morning, he's asked me to bring the word to you. And what I want to do is I want to bring a message about faith in a shattered world. Because all of us have had times in our lives where things have gone shattering. And this is an actual perfect group. So you have to listen, watch me moving my pages till about page 4. So if you're watching, you'll watch carefully. About page 4, I'm going to stop and ask the parents and the younger people. So that means you have to pay attention to me, guys. After page 4, you can ignore me. But after that, up until that point, you got to pay attention. So I'm going to ask you a question. And I want to get your honest opinion, because this morning we're not going to be looking at just something that is a Bible story. Though it is a story. It's real. It happened to real people, just like it happens to us. And that's how we're going to be able to see what happens to these young people and how it relates to us as believers today. So let me begin with this. Today we do live in a time which many are fearful about the future. And there's much uncertainty, instability. I mean, this last year and a half has just been kind of crazy. And it doesn't look like it's going to get any less crazy. But besides a techie guy, I'm also a history guy. So Reggie and I have something we share about that. We love to talk about history. If you talked about history, if you studied history, you realize there's nothing new about any of this. It just is a different form, a different flavor, but it doesn't matter. No matter what time you're in, no matter where you are, things can be scary, just to be honest. And it becomes scary regardless of whether you think today we may be living in, I call it Disneyland. We still live in a time where this country is prosperous, it's free relatively, it's almost irrationally rich. We have things that Solomon would be like, look, we have lights, we have a little gizmo that can pull me across the planet. Solomon would love to have that. I think Paul would love to have that. I don't know, getting on ships and sailing around. He would like to be able to have a little more leisure time. We get to live in a time that's amazing. And yet, even in that time, it personally is difficult for us. We have certain expectations because we live in this kind of a time. And it doesn't make it any less scary when we face difficulties, when God's providence touches us personally. And it's not so much that we don't believe that God is sovereign over the nations, because he is. It's not so much that we don't pray for his will to be done, because we do. What's scary about it is taking it from that intellectual understanding of who God is to when it personally touches us. And whether it's in our country, our nation, our home, our family, our church, wherever it is, it's something that is scary sometimes. Makes us anxious, creates doubt. It just does. Nothing you can do about it. And honestly, fear is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, I'm afraid of stepping out in front of a Mack truck traveling 60 miles an hour. Hopefully the rest of you would have that same fear reaction. If your truck's coming by, you don't step out in front of it. Why? Because it's a scary thing. So that scary thing teaches me something. Don't step out in front of a Mack truck, right? And fear is not a bad thing, and even in our walk of faith, because it's a natural reaction. God gave us the ability to be afraid of something, to teach us something. Now, where it becomes a problem is when that fear starts controlling us. There's a line where fear itself goes from the natural reaction to something that is a controlling thing. It starts dominating our lives. It starts ruling us. And therefore, we got a problem. And this morning, I don't really want to spend time on talking about, okay, was this fear? Is this good fear, bad fear? Is it the proper fear? Should I have this kind of fear? What I want to do is address a question that I think is even more important. And this is what the question is. How do we live? How do we live when God's providence comes in a form or a manner or some place that frightens us, that generates that fear? And it will. I mean, unless you're impervious to emotion, it's going to generate fear sometimes, and that's okay. But how do we live when we run into that kind of fear? What does our life really look like? And so what we're going to do for the rest of our time is we're going to look at God's providence, the fear that it often induces, and the faith that triumphs when we face these adverse conditions. And so to do so, we're actually going to be looking in the book of Daniel. Now, we're going to first go to the book of Habakkuk, but we're going to be in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, for the majority of this time. Now, that book is something that tells us a lot about the sovereignty of God and as his rule over the nations. And if you go through that book, you'll see that theme comes up over and over again. But it's more than that. In the narratives, we actually see that God's working in the nations, but he's working in the lives of individuals in those nations, whether it's kings or prophets or just everyday folk doing their job, going about their day, their business. But this is also a book about comfort. And a lot of times we think about Daniel, oh, it's a good bunch of Bible stories, Daniel in the lion's den and the Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace, or we're talking about eschatology, and the Ancient of Days came up to me and, seal up the prophecy in the book, and we get all crazy about that stuff. Well, if you really think about it, God had this written down to comfort the people of Israel. Look at what happens. No matter what comes at us, it is a book that says our God is a faithful God. And we have to be faithful people, even in the midst of these trials. And so this is a tremendous book of comfort. So I hope this morning, not only do we deal with fear and what we deal with it and how we live in it, but how are we comforted by the God of all comfort? And so let me just begin with a little bit of background, because the book of Daniel is so Bible storied out. There's a bunch of Bible stories, and that's a really cool thing, and that's good. But what's the context of the stories? If you don't have a context for something, you don't really understand what they're trying to teach. So let me begin here with a little background. First off, the book of Daniel begins in the year 605 BC, or in modern terms, BCE, as they like to reference it now. And it's in a time when there's political turmoil, there's military turmoil, there's all sorts of problems going on in people's lives. You have a nation that's degenerating, you have all sorts of things that are happening. Sounds familiar? The Neo-Babylonian Empire, that's the new Babylonian Empire, has just recently crushed the Assyrian Empire, which crushed the northern kingdom. So if you're following your Israelite history, the Assyrians crushed the northern kingdom. Well, the Babylonians crushed the Assyrians, and now they're coming after the southern kingdom, and they're also about to crush Egypt. So these guys are, kind of taking over the Middle East. And the last godly king in Israel died about 4 years earlier in 609. So you had a godly king up until that point. Now after this, you've got weak leadership. So you had a good leader, now you got bad leaders left in Israel. Or Judah, technically. And most likely in the summer, late summer, about this month, August 605 BC. So see, it's right on time, right on schedule, August of this year. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he takes Jerusalem and takes Daniel and his friends and some other young people captive. Their town, their country is invaded, and he takes over. And this Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, most of you have heard of him. He rules for 46 more years. This is when he takes over in 605, and he rules for 46 more years. And just before this time, and it's interesting, God's timing is perfect. The prophet Habakkuk is prophesying about how bad he thought things were. And in chapter 1, this is quite fascinating. So maybe you'll hear your voice echoed in it. I know I heard mine. It says, Habakkuk 1, it says, the Oracle of Habakkuk, the prophet saw, how long, O Lord, will I call out for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you, violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteousness. Therefore justice comes out perverted. If you haven't prayed those prayers, said those words, you're not paying attention to what's going on around you. Because this sounds really familiar. Of course, it sounds really familiar for every time and every culture and every people. But this is how Habakkuk saw his world just before these events. And what did God tell him? He says, look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days. You would not believe it if you were told. So sometimes we think we know what's going to happen. We think we understand. And God says, you'd be amazed. You'd be astounded. You wouldn't believe it if I told you what's going to happen. And he says, what am I going to do? For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march through the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate within themselves. In other words, they don't follow any rules. They do whatever they want to, and nobody can stop them. So if you thought it was bad with what you saw, guess what I'm doing? I'm sending devastation to you. So this is the background as we begin the book of Daniel. This is what happens as Daniel and his friends begin their journey, their life. And we're going to look at 4 things this morning. First off, we're going to look at a shattered home and country. We're going to then look at a shattered life and education. We're going to look at a shattered religion. And then we're going to see how God is silently glorified. So those are the 4 things we're going to look at. So, shattered home and country. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Daniel, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Aspenaz, the king of the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and the nobles. We'll pick up the rest of that verse in a minute. But this is the attack. And if you notice here, it says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. If you notice here, it didn't say Nebuchadnezzar came in and beat up the Israelite army and took over. God is directly attributed to turning over Israel, or Judah in this case, to Nebuchadnezzar. Just like was read this morning, Psalm 127. Unless the Lord guards the city, they labor in vain. If it wasn't for God's hand, remember, Sennacherib came back when the northern kingdom fell to Jerusalem, and he says, hey, nobody stopped us before. And Hezekiah, who was king, guess what happened? God stopped him. Here, he said, I'm coming, I'm sending the Chaldeans, and nobody's going to stop them. and he sent them. I don't know about you, but that kind of is a disturbing thought, isn't it? Sometimes God sends really bad stuff our way intentionally for his plans and purposes. That doesn't fit with my American everything should go well mind. How about you? But that's just not how I was raised. Isn't God great? Doesn't he give us great stuff? Isn't it wonderful? Yeah, he is wonderful. But sometimes not nice things happen. And they're frightening things. And so the one thing we do have to realize is God promised this was going to happen way back in King Manasseh's time. He promised that it was going to happen through Habakkuk, and nobody paid any attention. He also promised back in Deuteronomy this was going to happen, but let's not quibble over a couple of 100 years, right? He's been promising and telling us God's word's going to stand. We need to pay attention to when he tells us stuff. If he says do this, do it. If he says don't do this, don't do it. If he says treat people this way, do it, because he is the one whose word you pay attention to, regardless of what your society, your friends, your family, or anybody else tells you. And sadly, the church tells us that too much. Go ahead and pay attention to whatever you want. No. Pay attention to what God says. Now, something else that you have to realize is, and this is a good one for all of you guys who like to hike. Anybody like hiking? Like to hike? Good. All right. You get to go on an 800-mile hike. After your city's been taken, after you have been taken away from your family. Young folks, you guys like hiking, right? I can just see it. You're like, I want to go on an 800-mile hike, right? 800 miles, that's sign me up, boss. These people are going to be drug away 800 miles. And though the Mideast was a little greener and a little bit nicer 2,600 years ago, it still is a dry, hot place. So you're talking a month and a half to 3 months, depending on how fast they travel, of walking. They're not getting on Interstate 25 and heading back to Interstate 70, heading east. They're not going to go that way. They're walking. They're not even getting to ride on a camel. They're walking 800 miles. And they're getting to go to a wonderful new place. They get ripped away from their home. They get ripped away from their family. They get ripped away from everything they know. They're going to a different culture, different language, different customs, different food, different dress, different gods, and a different king. I don't know about you, but being away from home for 2 weeks and you travel someplace else or another country and you're eating the food that everybody else loves because they grew up with it, within 2 weeks you're coming back going, oh, please give me a hamburger, Something that simple. Everything they know is gone. They're going to a foreign land. And of course, there's not a lot of solace for these folks because these are young people. And there's few like them with them. They're traveling not alone, but what probably felt like it. And they're probably between the ages of 12 and 24. I'll give you that wide a range. Most people would say that Daniel and his friends were probably 16 to 18. 16 to 18 years old. So, all you juniors and seniors, seniors rule, right? Guess what? You get to be taken away from your family. You get to be taken and marched 800 miles with nobody else helping you to a completely foreign land, and you get a new life that you're going to get to live the rest of it. You may never see your parents again. Matter of fact, you probably won't. Anybody feeling really good about this? This sounds great. See, I told you, we live in Disneyland, folks. We live in wonderful times compared to this. And when God steps in, he steps in and he means it. So, what kind of fears might you have? All right. I'm going to start with the young people. All right, young people. Those who just are marching, you're 400 miles into this journey. Sophomore slump, only halfway through. If you don't know what the sophomore slump is, you will. You're only halfway through. All right, how do you feel about this? Great. Finally got away from mom and dad. This is interaction time. This is my one break in the sermon. All right. What do you guys think? How do you feel? I'm looking at you guys because you're close. But I see somebody else hiding. I see some other young people back there. How do you guys feel?
Tired and scared.
Tired and scared. Yep, I bet you would be. What else? How else would you feel? I was always interested in Persian food. Let's try it out. Of course, the Persians haven't taken over yet. I was excited to go explore who Marduk was. I was looking forward for a little travel. It was boring around my place. I bet you were tired and scared. Confused, wondering what's going to happen. Okay, let's turn it on the other side. Parents, you know how you feel. How do you feel? Wow, that was nice getting them out of the house that easy. No. And they're not coming back. They're not going to live in my basement. No. How would you feel? Especially you moms. Dad, you can just sit there and be stoic, right? Yeah, it's the kids. Toughen them up a little. Moms, dads, how do you feel? Your kids just got taken from you.
Worried about them.
Worried about them.
I'm terrified. You mean mad? Yeah. I'd be mad.
Mad, worried, terrified, devastated.
How about the old people?
Old people, not yet. We left the old people back there so we can go take care, make sure you stayed in line. That's why we took your kids, because guess what? You're not going to step out of line when I tell you to jump. You say, so how high? Because I got your kids. That's why they did it. And guess what? We're going to train up the next generation to ensure that you believe in Babylon, not Israel. We're going to see. So this is just the beginning, folks. Just the beginning of these events. Now, realize God sent this. So God has destroyed them. If you haven't started thinking, gee, God, but that doesn't seem very nice. How come you did that? Wait a second. Oh, it was just we didn't have a best defense budget and our laws weren't quite good enough. And we need to elect a new king and put the right things and it'll all be good. Yeah, no, God said, I'm sending them and they're coming and they did it. But you know what? Habakkuk, when he was making this prophecy, was just as scared, actually probably more so, when he heard about it. And in chapter 3, verse 2, it says, Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. He doesn't say, I heard about the report about the Chaldeans, and I fear. I heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of years. In the midst of years, make it known. In other words, the things that you said you were going to do, please remember them. Let's keep going. And remember that you still have a people, you've got a covenant here with them. And he says, in the midst of years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. See, that's a good thing. We have a merciful God. Even when there is wrath, even when bad things happen, he is still merciful. And you have to realize this was the first of 3 invasions. The temple is destroyed in the last one. The walls of Jerusalem are destroyed in the last one. And the temple is not restored for 70 years after the last one. And the walls of the city, which protect the city, are not rebuilt for another 130 years after that. So 200 years. You're talking Andrew Jackson's time in U.S. history. You're talking 40 years before the U.S. Civil War. 200 years from the time Nebuchadnezzar and all destroys the city and the walls to the time the walls are finally rebuilt, and that's in the time of Nehemiah. So if you want to know when Nehemiah is, that's when Nehemiah is. And so you would think that after all this devastating news, God would go, okay, you're on your own. But he doesn't. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, it says, Then the Lord answered me and said, Record the vision and inscribe it on the tablets, that the one who reads it may run. In other words, it's coming, folks. For the vision is yet to be for the appointed time. It hastens towards the goal. It will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it. For it will certainly come and will not delay. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. But the righteous will live by faith. And that is going to be the comfort. That is going to be the key to everything Daniel and his friends are going to experience. And so you can see In this shattered world, the only thing you have is faith. No mom and dad, no children, no nothing. Because this is just the beginning of the shattering. We haven't even gotten to the even more devastating parts of it. This is just, hey, you're going to a different country. You're not going to have your friends. Because it gets worse than that. So let's look at the next step in this process, a shattered life in education. Verse 4, it says, who is this chief official supposed to pull out? He was supposed to pull out youths in whom was no defect, who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, who had ability for serving in the king's court, and he ordered them to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. So in other words, if we were going to put it in modern terms, okay, I want you to go get the best and the brightest young people, and they're going to serve me. That's who I want. All right, folks, don't you want your children to be the best and the brightest and to work hard and all the other good stuff, and you've been pouring your lives into making sure that they got their best opportunities? Those are the ones I want. You got the slackers? I don't want slackers. I want really the top notch. And this is, I want the physically and I want the emotionally solid, no defect people. But he doesn't stop at that. He says, not only no defect, I want the good looking ones. I need Hollywood here, right? I want the ones who could star in the movie. So, you want your kids good looking, well dressed, etc. Well, guess what? That's exactly who the king wants too. Showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom. In other words, these kids have been taught well and demonstrated not only do they know stuff, they're good at applying it and using it. I don't want a bunch of yes men. I want people who can think. These are the folks I want. This is the king's parameters, but it's by God's hand. So parents, look, you've been training your kids to be the best they possibly can be, and through your wonderful training, they're the ones that get taken. Feel great about that, moms? Wait a second. If I was just a slacker, I would have been okay. Oh, wait a second. It was because you were a bunch of slackers that God sent these people in the first place. So sometimes I guess ignorance is bliss and mediocrity is okay, but that's not who we're supposed to be as believers, are we? We're supposed to honor God in everything, do the best we can, whatever that best looks like. This is who God wants. And you know what? He's going to use these people. He's going to use these people for his purpose and his glory. So they have this new life and vocation and new master because they're no longer allowed to serve their family, their tribe, their nation. They have to go to the court of a pagan king and serve him. And oh, by the way, some of that will be over Israel, or Judah, who's going to be part of that kingdom. And now think about it in this term. Think about whatever country, whatever government, whatever party, whatever anything you think of as yuck. And now I'm going to tell you, you, or better, your kids are going to go serve them. How do you feel? The enemy, the ones that I cannot stand, the ones who have destroyed my country, your kids are going to go serve them. And kids, you've been ripped away. You get to go serve the bad guys. That's not your job, is it? It was supposed to take care of my mom and dad, to take care of my tribe. I was supposed to run the local family business. Some of these people were nobles in Israel. They were supposed to lead the nation. Nope, you get to go serve the foreign king. Anybody say, gee, my life didn't turn out the way I thought it was going to? That wasn't how I had it planned. God, do you really know what you're doing? And this is exactly what's happening to these people. Not only do they get to go serve somebody else and have a different life, they get to learn new things. Isn't it wonderful? You get to go learn new things. I love learning new things. I love to learn. By the way, I get to learn a rigorous 3-year training program of a new language, which I'm terrible at. Arts, agriculture, sciences, even though that's a misnomer, including divination, astrology, all the religions, laws, customs of the Babylonians. All right, go pick your favorite country you've never heard of, and you get to go learn everything about them. You get to go learn their language, their cultures, and you get to do all the things about that one. Right? You don't even get to learn about your own. You get to learn about that one. And so they would have, quote unquote, a secular and religious education, but it certainly wouldn't be Judaic. There's nobody there left, right? Mom and dad aren't there. How much, if you left right now, would you know about the scriptures with mom and dad not there? No pastors, no teachers, no church. What would you carry with you? Because that's all they have. But what's interesting is in these cultures, the religious beliefs form the core of their society. And I'm not going to go into the gory detail of this, but we can talk about it another time. The reality of what we consider secular and religious, science and deity and faith, these are all modern concepts. They did not exist in this time period. Matter of fact, they're only within the last 300 years. We think in those terms. So even I say science, natural, supernatural, those terms did not exist. They did not even enter their thinking. They had I call it cake theology. Everything on the first layer is everything that's happening in your realm. And regardless of whether you can explain it or not, there's a second layer, deity, over the top of it. Deity is what is in charge of everything, regardless of cause and effect and anything else here. That's cake theology. That's how they viewed their world. That's what the scriptures were written into, people who viewed their world that way. We live in a culture in what I call pie theology. There's this pie, and everything in the pie that hasn't been cut out is all the things science can explain. And then there's this sliver that science can't explain, and we call that divine. And of course, as science explains more and more, what happens to the need for God? Why do I need God? There's no God because I can explain everything. Anybody face that one? If you haven't, young people, you will. That is the thinking pattern we live in. They didn't think that way. The Bible's not written to that culture. Regardless if you can explain every single thing in the pie, deity's over the top of it all. God is in charge. So the moment you fall into the trap of thinking in pie theology, you're trapped. Think cake, because that's the Bible. That's what they had to learn. They had to learn cake. They didn't learn pie. They learned cake. Because that is how their societies ran. Their rules, their laws, their interactions, and everything else was cake, not pie. So think about the mental transformation that's going on. It's not, okay, I can just believe this stuff over here or disbelieve this stuff over here, but I know the truth. It's one and the same. This is how they thought. This is how they're being trained. This is how they're being educated. So what are the results of this? So we're going to jump ahead to verse 17 through 19. And it says, as for these 4 youth, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of wisdom and literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of dreams and visions. The end of the day, then at the end of the days, which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. Now, what you have to realize is they've gone through this 3 years of extensive training. They've had to study, they've had to work, they've had to do all the stuff. Okay, so see, everybody, even if you get captive, you still got to do your homework. Still part of education. You got to do it. And so they go ahead and they are taught. And they are then examined. Still have tests. Sorry, kids. I can't get away from those, can you? Always have tests. But guess what? We all have tests, don't we, in life? But if you notice here, it says, God gave them. Doesn't say their teacher enlightened them. It says God gave them. Just like God gave the king over, God gave the vessels, the instruments of the vessels into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, God gave these young people this wisdom. And it doesn't say all of them, does it? Not all equal, is it? God gave these 4 that we know of. And what did he give them? Knowledge and intelligence, or it could also be translated prudence. And Daniel, who was even out of those 4, separated out. He could even understand visions and dreams. And guess what? We see in the next sections of the book him understanding dreams and visions and things like that. So God gifted this one guy, Daniel, out of all of those, that extra special gifting. And that is going to be used by God through Daniel with his pagan king and others that follow along. And that is going to all be used to God's purpose and plan and wisdom and glory. I want you to notice here, the text doesn't say, by the way, they had a hunger strike, they rebelled, they demanded, their parents wrote letters to the congressman, whatever. They learned, they excelled, and they were blessed by God for their efforts. And I'm not saying don't write your congressman. I'm just saying they did what they had to do because that's what they had to do. And they had to learn about false gods. They had to learn about false teaching, had to learn laws, practices that may even have been forbidden, some of them under the Torah. And then they had to oversee people who thought their God was inferior to their gods. Because see, in those times, if you beat another country, your God was beating their God. Remember cake? My God beat your God, therefore my country beat your country. Therefore my God's more powerful than your God. And guess what? You get to learn about that God because he's the great one, or she's the great one, depending on which god or goddess you happen to be under at that time. But see, these guys can just continued and prepared and did everything as unto the Lord. I'm going to be the best of whatever I have to be because this is where God's put me. I don't have a choice. And guess what? They didn't escape their fate. Look, if I really be good and I do all the right things, God will let me go. Maybe, but not in this case. For Daniel, he gets to serve there his entire life. And jumping ahead, the man's there for nearly 70 years. He probably never got to go home. He may never have had a chance to see his parents again. And it is debatable, depending on which scholar you read, whether he even was allowed to have a family. Because entering the king's service very often, you got to be painfully become a eunuch. Though possibly he could have not. But that wouldn't have been so much fun. Look at your life. It's cut off. Everything. And yet this man just continues to serve and continues to serve and continues to serve faithfully because that's what God has for him in his life. I just want to just toss this out as a thought provoker. But is it really our typical thinking to say, wow, isn't it great to have a godly person in the, I'll use our modern term, administration of somebody we don't like? That's a great thing, isn't it? We have this godly person there. No, we're usually saying, I don't want to serve with that person. I want out of here. I'm done. I don't want to have a bad boss. I'm gone. I'm out of here because no godly person should be associated with that person, right? And yet, isn't it amazing? And if you read the rest of Daniel, the book basically says this godly guy kept doing the right thing, kept helping people, kept being fair and just, kept doing all the different things that he needed to do to ensure that justice was done properly. The law was maintained correctly. And eventually it gets him in so much trouble. He's so good at it. People want him to throw him in the lion's den by chapter 6. The man is just a faithful man. And it's better to have an honorable person in a bad place than a dishonorable person in a bad place. You guys do realize that criminals look for really squeaky clean accountants, right? You know why they do that? What do you think? How did Al Capone get caught in his bootlegging? Taxes. There you go. See, the taxes will get you. Remember death and taxes? Taxes are really powerful. So you want really good accountants if you're a criminal. Trustworthy ones that aren't going to steal from you. Isn't it amazing? Really, really bad people like really good people working for them as long as they're under their control. So you might be in that situation. And so we've seen that they have a shattered home, a shattered country, a shattered life, and a shattered education. So let's turn to their religious practices. And now I want to be very clear here. When I say religion, I'm not talking about faith. Their faith is not shattered. What they can do in their religious practice is, though, there is no temple for them to sacrifice at. There are no priests. There is nothing. A matter of fact, this is a little interesting quirk of you never know what God's really doing. Look around, be amazed and astounded. This is the time period in Jewish history that the synagogue was developed during the Babylonian captivity. And the synagogue became the model of the early church, which, by the way, look at where we are today, guys. So this gathering right here has roots that go all the way back to the Babylonian captivity and all these horrible things God did. So are you saying God did a really bad thing that we got together this morning? See? God in his wisdom knew we were going to be here 2,600 years later in August of 2021 when that destruction happened in August 605 BC. And he planted the seeds for this gathering way back then. It's amazing what God does that we don't get. And so this is about their faith, or their shattered religion, not their faith. Now, for sake of time, I'm going to be really nice and I'm not going to go through all the detail of this. Because as much as Reggie said, you guys are really patient for long-winded sermons, I know that this one is going to go way longer than it should. Which is good because chapter 6 was longer than this. But let's look. Verse 5, jumping backwards, says the king appointed for them daily rations. These are the people who are the young people are going to be trained. Daily rations from the king's table of choice food and the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, and at the end of this they were entered to the king's personal service. We just saw the outcome of that. Now among them were the sons of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and Daniel was assigned Belteshazzar, Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego, which is typically the names that most of us know them from Bible stories. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Now, I'm not going to go to the detail. I can give you my notes if you want to look at the details of this. But basically, what they're doing is they're renaming them for their gods. All these guys were named after or related to Yahweh or El or Yah or Ayah. Those are all their names are associated with God. My judge, he's been gracious, who is what God is, and the Lord is my help. They get renamed to the Babylonian deities. Belshazzar probably means Bel, which means Lord, who Marduk was the god there, protect his life. Shadrach, command of Aku, the Sumerian moon god. Meshach probably means who is like Aku, which is that Sumerian god. And Abednego means servant of Nego or Nebu, which Nebuchadnezzar, he was named after Nebu, the god. And so their names that were given to them by faithful parents associated with their God were replaced by the names of the Babylonian gods. Think about that. If you don't like your name, we're going to give you a new one. Except your name was named for your God. Now your name is named for somebody else, another God. Would you like to introduce yourself and say, hi, I'm whatever? Pick a religion that you go, I don't want to be named that. and get that new name, and that's the one you get to use the rest of your life? I mean, how many of us would bite our tongue going, oh, my name? Be pretty tough, wouldn't it? I won't pick on any religions, but you can pick some that you know that have very popular names that you get to be named after. And now, you have a spiritual challenge. Now, I'm going to summarize the not Daniel diet because what happens next is this food. Daniel and his friend Daniel says he made up his mind not to be defiled himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now, again, in verse 9 it says, now God granted favor. So again, God took them, God helped them with their education, now God grants them favor. So if you have noticed, God's still working in all this. But what happens is basically they are given the choice food from the king's table. And that was a tremendous honor. To be given food from the king's table was an honor. Matter of fact, we see the wedding feast of the Lamb. We see the David, people eating from his table. You see all the different things. To eat food from the king's table is a great honor. And Daniel says, I don't want to defile myself by eating that food. You're like, later on, Daniel will drink wine and eat food from the king's table and other things like that. Why is he suddenly, as this young kid, remember, saying, I'm not going to do this because it'll defile me? Now, there's lots and lots of ways that you can understand this defilement. And typically the word is associated with impure or improper. And very often it's related to sacrifices or other behaviors. Sometimes it's regarding murder or blood vengeance. In other words, it's an improper thing. So defile, we sometimes just think, oh, it's filthy, but it's really just, it's not right. Right? Just think of it in those terms. And most often people say, oh, well, it was a dietary law. Or it was because it was meat sacrificed to idols. Well, the New Testament already tells us, there's no real gods, and they knew that and all the other kinds of stuff. But what I believe, because of the way this narrative describes them, that he says, Daniel said, the overseer says, I'm afraid of the Lord, the king, who has appointed food for you. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths of the other of your aides? And then you make me forfeit my head to the king? Okay. In other words, it's something about this effect of not eating this good food that is going to, the commander is going to be saying, I don't want to risk you guys looking bad. So it's an external appearance. Now, if you really think about what's going on with Daniel, I think this is really more associated with, yes, it's associated with their deity, but it's associated with the faith in their God to provide for them. Okay? Because in this training and in this time, and the appearance is directly related to the food. And in their time period, the food was given to the idol, which was representative of the deity. So you were serving the deity and there would be a blessing from it. So eating the food that was going to be from the king's table came from the food that was associated with the deity, which came to be seen as a blessing from the deity, right? That's the way they would have thought about it. So if you put that in your head and you go back and you say, okay, how would this defile Daniel? It would be a defiling thing based on, I look good because your God was giving me blessing. Versus, I'm not going to eat that, so nobody can say it was your God who blessed my appearance. It was my God, because I'm going to eat not your God's stuff. Okay? I'm going to eat in a way that is going to be dependent on my God. And so I think that may be, in this context, a better answer than, okay, it was just about gods and deities and things like that. It was, where is my faith? Who am I trusting? Well, in the end, he goes through the test. He gives them a test, we'll talk about in a moment, and they end up looking better and fatter. So this isn't the Daniel diet. I don't want to go on a diet that I eat vegetables and get fatter. I don't need fatter. Okay, some of you guys are still skinny. But trust me, eating a vegetable diet to make me fatter is not one of the things I want to claim as the great diet. So it's not the Daniel diet. This is a diet of faith. This is a choice that says I'm going to trust my God to make me continue looking good for the king because I'm trusting my God. If you notice, it's not public either. It's not he goes before Nebuchadnezzar and says, I'm not going to eat your food, king. He goes to the commander and asks. Then he goes to the official under him and asks. So how many people really know about this? Not many. This isn't a public protest. This isn't waving banners. This isn't hunger strikes. This is, I just am asking permission. So have you ever gone into a situation where you need to ask permission for something that should just be just between you and that person? Do you mind if? See, Daniel does this. And he's going to trust God. But it says in the text that God granted him favor. God could have said no. That's hard, isn't it? When you know this is a good thing, and look, I'm trying to be faithful, God. I'm trying to show you are the one. It's not this other God. And he could have said no. I think Daniel would have gone ahead and ate the food. Wouldn't have been a problem. He said, I tried. I did my best. God said no. Such is life. That's okay. He didn't have to go 1,000 ways. But the nice thing about it is the commander who says, I'm afraid, he goes to the guy under him and he says, well, let me give you a little short-term test. 10 days. That's all I ask. Give me 10 days, test me, and then you decide. Right? If you don't think I look good enough, I'm not going to argue with you. No, look, I look great. If you don't think I look good enough, if we don't look right eating this food, so be it. We'll eat the other stuff. But if you do, let us keep doing this. So in other words, it's a visible, tangible test with visible, tangible outcome that is entrusted to the person that you asked to make the decision. That's pretty fair, isn't it? Very reasonable. It's not demanding beyond reason. It's a very reasonable request. So if you notice, look at these young people, 16 to 18-year-olds, interacting with incredibly powerful people and thinking it through, going, okay, this guy's scared. Have you ever thought of the other side of this equation? This official is scared, and Daniel, who is a teenager, is thinking of the feelings and the perspective of this other guy. He's thinking of other people, not just, hey, I've got to honor my God. I've got to show you guys. He goes, I would like to show you guys who my God really is. I would love to have the opportunity to do this. But I understand you fear for your very life. Let me come up with something that's reasonable, that's small, that's testable, that lets you make the decision. Now, don't you feel a little more comfortable if you're the commander when you know your life could be in jeopardy if this guy comes to you and it's because of my God? And again, these weren't godless people. They just were false godless people. These people believed in deity. They're not like our modern society that, God, who cares? They believed in deity. And they could respect a man who comes and says, I want to honor my God. And I'm going to let you do it. And I know you're afraid. How many of us today think of other people when we get up on our high horse about this is the right thing to do before God, right? How many of us stop and go, that other person is scared. That other person doesn't get it. That other person does not think like I think. They do not have the security I have in Christ. Do we think about that before we charge in? If you notice, these young people, but you know what? God has given them wisdom. Because they're dependent on him. That's what he wants. The righteous shall live by faith. So, do we have that kind of faith? Do we request instead of demand? Do we not argue, but we consider others? Do we allow God to make the decision as opposed to, I'm going to get it by hook or by crook. I'm going to figure out the way to get the way I want to have it done. You notice they couldn't, in their life, they could not go to the temple. They could not offer a sacrifice because they only could live by faith, because that's exactly what God told Habakkuk. That is how you're going to have to live when this comes. But to our last point, God is silently glorified in this. You'll see in the rest of the book, God is more publicly glorified to the point where you get to chapter 6. God is proclaimed, do not mess with this guy. He is amazing. Right now, nobody's going to know about it. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding, this is verse 20, about which the king consulted them, the young men, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all of his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. The only thing that is going to be seen out of these events from that time is a few people, that they trusted their God. But when Christ is revealed, every single act will be revealed. Every single glory to God will be given. Think about this. Every day, that's how we live. When you don't cheat on your taxes, God is glorified. When you don't do what you really want to do, you restrain. I want to do this, but I don't. God is glorified. Every thought that could go down the dark path that's held captive, God is glorified. Every kind word, every gesture, God is glorified, and nobody sees it. He does. And ultimately, just like this, God will be glorified in our daily acts, just like these guys. This will be something, I mean, it's nice that we can see it, but God is glorified in these actions. And it's interesting, he said, the way it's written, he found them 10 times better, which basically means they were head and shoulders above everybody else. The creme de la creme. Pick whatever superlative that you can do. That's how good these guys excelled in what they did for this pagan king, in this pagan land, in this pagan education, in this everything, not what they were supposed to be doing. And yet that's who they were. God is glorified in that. Now, if you notice here, it doesn't say, and they went about sinning, killing people, right? No. They honored. They did the right thing. But they knew. Now think about this. Just one little diversion and we'll close. If you know about the people you're overseeing, their views, their perspectives, how they think, can you not be more sensitive when you engage them? Can you not be more creative in the way you interact with them? Can you not think about their feelings and their perspective and engage them in a graciousness, not backing away from truth, but a graciousness that comes along with it? Now, if you just stereotype them and know nothing about them and nothing about what they believe and nothing about how they think, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to project my views on them. And how come you idiots don't get it, right? Can't you see this is true? Versus these guys knew exactly how they thought, exactly the way they were thinking, and they could manage, they could interact, they could do all sorts of things. That's why they were 10 times better than anybody else. They had a godly perspective and a worldly understanding. They had both, and they then could be 10 times better when questioned. How would you handle this, Daniel? How would you do this, Meshach? Explain to me how you would handle this situation under my law and rule. I can take my God's view and I can put it into practice in your culture. It's amazing what they can do because of what God has put them through. This is not the way I would have done it, but this is the way God does it. So, to conclude, God providentially put Daniel and his friends in this situation. He providentially gave them grace. He providentially gave them knowledge. He providentially gave them favor. Doesn't mean they got to do what they wanted to do. They didn't get preference. And God is going to be glorified in it. But let me flip you back to Habakkuk real quick. Habakkuk, at the end of the book, he turns this into a song. He said, I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay entered my bones, and in my place I trembled, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. In other words, this guy is just devastated knowing what's coming. And he says, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olives should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. For the Lord God is my strength. He has made my feet like hinds' feet, and made me walk on my high places. And this is for the choir director. And think about this. Maybe this very song was on the lips of Daniel and his friends as they're marching that 800 miles, or studying late at night, or dealing with all these situations. Who knows? What melody is in our heart today? Can we sing that? And so, may we live by our faith, because that is how the righteous live. When our world is shattered or torn up, or there's a pothole, or whatever it is, and be comforted by the God of all comfort. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time together. We thank you for your word, and we especially thank you for your Son. And we don't have to live under this old covenant. We get to live in the new one. We get to live a life, no matter where we are in our life, we are walking in faith for you. Our thoughts are taken captive. We give glory and honor to your name in everything, and it will all be revealed when your Son is revealed. It's in his name we do pray. Amen.